They shut down our family deli without warning, claiming zoning violations. But it was all part of Charles Whitman's ruthless plan to replace us with luxury condos. The man who once smiled in our shop was secretly tearing apart our community for profit, calling us roadblocks to progress. Armed with undeniable evidence and the strength of our town, we took the fight straight to him. And trust me, the way justice came crashing down will leave you stunned, because sometimes the truth is the most powerful weapon of all. The day the zoning board shut down Taylor's Homestead Deli began like any other. Sunlight streamed through the windows as my mom hummed a tune while slicing sweet potatoes for her famous pies. Dad was in the back, slow-cooking brisket, the rich, smoky aroma curling into the air like a promise of comfort. The bell above the front door jingled as Mrs. Green came in for her usual morning coffee and a cinnamon roll. It was normal, familiar, safe. Until it wasn't. It started with a knock, sharp, urgent, like a harbinger of bad news. A stern-faced man in a navy blue uniform walked in, holding a clipboard like a weapon. Behind him, a younger woman with a camera snapped photos of every corner of our shop. "Mr. Taylor," the man said flatly, his tone stripped of empathy. "We're here to enforce a zoning violation." "What?" I asked, stepping forward. Mom froze mid-slice, and Dad came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Effective immediately, your business is in violation of new zoning regulations." The officer handed me a notice filled with legal jargon that might as well have been in a foreign language. "You'll need to cease operations and vacate the premises within 24 hours. My heart plummeted. "This must be a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've been here for over 30 years. There's never been an issue before." The officer didn't even flinch. "The regulations were updated recently. This is non-negotiable." "No warning? No chance to fix things?" I could hear the crack in my voice now, the disbelief fighting to hold back the anger. "I'm just doing my job," he said with a shrug. Then, without another word, he stepped outside and slapped a bright red, "Closed by order of the zoning board" sign on our door. The sound of the adhesive smacking the glass was like a gunshot, a finality I couldn't undo. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Green, still clutching her coffee, stared at the sign as though it was a death sentence. "This can't be legal, Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her words hit me like a plea for salvation, but I didn't have any answers. Customers muttered among themselves, some pacing angrily, others trying to comfort Mom as tears welled in her eyes. Dad stood silently beside her, his lips pressed into a thin line, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. I stood there in shock, staring at the sign until the words blurred. Then I forced myself to look at the notice again, this time reading the fine print. The more I read, the angrier I became. The new regulations were vague at best, full of loopholes and legalese, and they had been approved just weeks ago, conveniently timed to target long-standing businesses like ours. As I looked around at the crowd, my eyes caught something strange. On the opposite side of the street, the Johnson's bookstore had the same red sign. So did the Chang's flower shop a block down, and the Ortiz family cafe. My stomach churned as the pattern became glaringly obvious. Every single business targeted by these so-called violations was minority-owned. Black, Asian, Latino. It didn't matter. They were coming for us all. Coincidence? Not a chance. The officer's words echoed in my head. Just doing my job. But whose job was it, really? Who stood to gain from gutting an entire street of thriving, community-driven businesses? As the crowd dispersed, their murmurs heavy with outrage and uncertainty. I clenched my fists, the paper crumpling under the force of my grip. This wasn't just about Taylor's Homestead Deli. It was about something much bigger, something deliberate, something cruel, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of our new reality pressed down on us like a storm cloud that refused to pass. The deli, once the heartbeat of our family and our livelihood, stood dark and empty. The once familiar hum of activity was replaced by an eerie stillness that seeped into every corner of our lives. At home, the tension was palpable. Bills piled up on the counter like a cruel reminder of the life we were losing. Mom, usually the calm and steady force in our family, grew quiet, her eyes shadowed with worry. Dad, who'd always been my unshakable role model, now looked smaller somehow, as if the fight had been drained out of him. The kitchen, once filled with the smell of brisket and the sound of laughter, became a battleground of hushed arguments. "I'll take another shift at the factory," Dad muttered one night, his voice clipped. "We shouldn't have to live like this," Mom shot back, her words sharp enough to cut. Then silence. That silence became our new normal. It was heavy, suffocating. It clung to us during meals, followed us into our separate corners of the house, and haunted my sleepless nights. I couldn't stand it. One evening, restless and desperate, I sat at the dining room table surrounded by piles of zoning documents, old property records, and printouts from the town's archives. The faint glow of the kitchen light illuminated the papers as I pored over them for the 100th time, searching for something, anything that could explain why this had happened. That's when I saw it. A zoning ordinance labeled Amendment 47B caught my eye. It was dated just 2 months before the shutdown, slipped quietly into effect with almost no public discussion. The language was deliberately vague, filled with terms like community preservation and urban redevelopment. At first glance, it sounded harmless, even helpful, but as I read further, the loopholes became glaring. It was practically designed to give the zoning board carte blanche to shut down small businesses like ours. My stomach twisted. Who had pushed this through? The answer came with my next discovery. Alongside the amendment was a proposal for a brand new development project, luxury condos and retail spaces set to replace the very street where our deli and every other minority-owned business had stood. The project leader, Charles Whitman. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Charles Whitman, the head of the zoning board. The same man who used to stop by the deli on Saturday mornings, his politician's smile plastered across his face as he shook my dad's hand and praised the charm of our little business. I remembered how he'd chat with Mom about her pies, his voice dripping with fake warmth, all while indulging in a free slice. But now, all I could hear was his voice echoing in my head. Preserving the charm of the community. What a joke. Whitman had never cared about our community. He'd been planning to tear it apart from the start. The thought made my chest ache. This was someone we had trusted, someone who'd presented himself as an ally of the small-town businesses that gave our neighborhood its soul. And yet, here he was, orchestrating the destruction of everything we'd built. I wanted to slam my fist on the table, to scream, to wake up my parents and tell them what I'd found. But I stopped myself. Anger wasn't enough, not yet. I needed more. I needed proof. As I sat there in the dim light, my resolve hardened. Whitman might have been playing a long game, but so was I now. Whatever it took, I would uncover the full truth. I would shine a light on his lies and expose the corruption behind those fake smiles. Because this wasn't just about our deli anymore. It was about every business, every family, every dream that he was so casually destroying. Whitman had underestimated us, and that would be his downfall. Fueled by determination and a growing sense of purpose, I threw myself into the work of uncovering the truth. Late nights turned into early mornings as I scoured public records, zoning board meeting minutes, and financial disclosures. It wasn't glamorous. My eyes ached from staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, and my dining room table was buried under stacks of papers and hastily scribbled notes. But every sleepless hour brought me closer to understanding the depth of the scheme. The picture was horrifyingly clear. Whitman wasn't acting alone. A group of powerful real estate developers had been working hand in hand with him to gut the very soul of Maplewood. Their plan was as ruthless as it was simple. Shut down small businesses under the guise of zoning violations, claim the land, and replace our street with luxury condos and high-end boutiques. The timeline was no coincidence. Our closure notices aligned perfectly with their project proposals. Each new discovery lit a fire in me. It wasn't just my family they'd hurt. It was Mrs. Chang, whose flower shop had been a staple for decades. It was the Ortiz family, whose cafe was the heart of weekend mornings, their empanadas a local legend. It was every small business owner who had poured their lives into building something meaningful, only to have it stripped away by greed. But as much as I wanted to take this fight head on, I knew I couldn't do it alone. I started reaching out to the others. Mrs. Chang was the first to join me. She was hesitant at first, her hands trembling as she folded flyers for her flower shop in her now empty storefront. But when I showed her the documents tying Whitman to the developers, the hesitation turned to resolve. "They've taken everything from us," she said, her voice firm. "We can't let them win." Next were the Ortizes. Luis Ortiz, the family patriarch, shook his head in disbelief when I laid out the evidence. "They want us to give up, don't they?" he said, a grim smile on his face. "They picked the wrong people to mess with." Together, we began to build a coalition. We held meetings in living rooms and closed down storefronts, sharing our stories, our fears, and our determination. We drafted a petition demanding a public hearing to address the zoning board's actions. Each signature we collected felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming what was stolen. Then, a breakthrough. Leah Carter, a young journalist for the Maplewood Gazette, caught wind of our efforts. She met me at the deli's shuttered front door one crisp morning, her notebook and recorder in hand. "Tell me everything," she said. Leah was relentless. She dug deeper into the story, connecting the dots between Whitman, the developers, and the shady zoning amendments. Her article, titled "Small Businesses in Danger: The Corruption of Maplewood's Zoning Board," wasn't just a piece of local news, it was a rallying cry. It went viral, shared by residents far beyond our town. People were outraged, furious that their community was being sold off piece by piece. And the pressure was building. Protesters began showing up at Town Hall with signs that read, "Save Maplewood" and "Justice for Small Businesses." Our coalition grew as more people came forward, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment and unfulfilled promises. Local news stations picked up the story, amplifying our voices. For the first time, Whitman was on the defensive. He couldn't brush us aside or dismiss us as a few disgruntled business owners. The spotlight was on him now, and the more he tried to deny the allegations, the more the evidence stacked up against him. Finally, the zoning board announced a public hearing. It wasn't an admission of guilt. Whitman framed it as an opportunity to address the concerns of the community. But we knew better. This wasn't about transparency. This was about survival. For him, not for us. The date was set. We had one shot to make our case, to expose the truth to everyone who would listen. As the day approached, I felt a mix of fear and resolve. They had underestimated us from the beginning, but now the whole town was watching, and we were ready to fight. The hearing was a battleground. The packed room buzzed with supporters holding signs like "Save Our Town" and "No to Corruption." Whitman sat confidently, dismissing our claims as mere baseless accusations. But he wasn't ready for the avalanche of evidence we had gathered. Taking the podium, my heart pounded as I presented damning details: secret meetings, blatant conflicts of interest, and financial ties to developers. The final blow came from Leah's discovery of an email where Whitman called our businesses roadblocks to progress. Outrage swept through the crowd. Shouts of anger filled the room. With public pressure mounting, the board launched an investigation. Within weeks, Whitman was ousted, and the corrupt zoning rules were revoked. Reopening Taylor's Homestead Deli felt surreal. Mom's pies sold out instantly, and Dad's brisket sandwiches were a hit once more. Our victory was about more than just a deli. It was a community reclaiming its voice. Looking around at familiar faces in the bustling street, I realized the power of unity. Together, we had proven that when people stand firm, even the mightiest corruption can be brought to its knees.